Hi friends, today we are going to discuss with a new chapter called consideration. We all know what do you mean by consideration. Consideration simply means something in return. So in order to make a valid contract, consideration is an essential element. Okay, so consideration simply means something in return. So today we are going to discuss in detail what do you mean by consideration. First of all, we can look into the definition of consideration. According to the Frederick Pollock, consideration is the price for which the promise of the other is sought and the promise thus given for value is enforceable. Okay, so what do you mean by consideration? From the definition it is clear that it is the price for which the promise of the other is sought. So there will be two parties in a particular contract. So one party is making the offer and the another party is accepting that particular offer. So we all know that the offer plus acceptance comes to an agreement or a contract. Okay, so consideration, it is the price for the promise that is made by the another party. So if one of the parties is making a promise to another party, the another party should make or give a particular price to the opposite party. That particular price can be called as the consideration. So we can sum up that the consideration simply means something in return. It can be price or it can be anything. Okay, anything else. Okay, so this is the definition of consideration. And next we can look into the essentials of consideration. Okay, in order to become a valid consideration, what are the essentials that is needed? First one, it must move at the desire of the promiser. Okay, so who is the promiser? Promiser is the person who make promise to another person. So it should be that the consideration should be move at the desire of the promiser. Okay, so promiser will have a desire and this promiser should make the terms and conditions that he wants this particular consideration and it must be communicated to the promisee. Okay, so the promise, it is the responsibility and duty of the promisee to give that particular consideration to the promiser. So from the sentence it is clear that the consideration must move at the desire of the promiser. And second one, it may move from the promisee. Okay, it may move from the promisee means if the promisee is saying that I will pay a particular consideration to this particular thing. Okay, so it may move from the promisee. So it may move from the promisee. That is the second element of consideration. So promisee, we know that the person to whom the promise is made can be called as the promisee. So if the promisee is saying to the promiser, I will give you a particular thing as a consideration, so it can be treated as a valid consideration. So the consideration may move from the promisee also. The third one, it may be past, present or future. So the consideration may be past, present or future. So it will be discussed in the later sessions. And next one, it must be real and not illusory. That means the consideration should be real in nature. It should not be an illusory concept or illusory thing. Okay, so the consideration, it means something in return, so it must be really exist. Really, there should be an existence for that particular consideration. Otherwise, it is not treated as a valid consideration. And next one, the consideration must be lawful in nature, because if both the parties are entering into a contract, there must be consideration, and that particular consideration that is given by the promisee to the promiser should be under law. It should be legally valid consideration. And next one, the consideration need not be adequate. That means the consideration that is given in a particular contract, there is no criteria that it need not be adequate. It need not be adequate in nature. It may be adequate, it may not be adequate. That is the condition. Okay, so there is no specific criteria that it should be adequate in nature. So these are the essentials of consideration. That means it must move at the desire of the promiser. Second one, it may move from the promisee also. Then it may be present, past or future. Then it must be real and not illusory. Then it must be lawful in nature and it need not be adequate. Of consideration, that is, the consideration can be classified into past consideration, present consideration and future consideration. So what do you mean by past consideration? If the consideration is received by the particular person before the date of promise, it can be called as the past consideration. Okay, so if one party is receiving the consideration before the date of promise, it can be called as the past consideration. And second one, present consideration. If the party is receiving the consideration simultaneously with the promise or at the same period of time, it can be called as the present consideration. And future consideration, it is the consideration on both sides moves at a future date. So both the parties agreed that they may transfer the consideration at a particular future date. It can be called as the future consideration. So these are the types of consideration, that is past, present and future. And there is a rule, or there is a slogan that contracts without consideration. The general rule is that if there is no consideration, there is no contract, because we have studied that consideration is one of the most important element of a contract. So general rule, if there is no consideration, there is no contract. But there are some exceptions. Okay, so that we will discuss. A promise without consideration is void or nudum pactum. Okay, so if the contract is entered without any consideration, it is treated as void. That means it is treated as an invalid contract. In the eyes of law, there is no legal acceptance or legal validity for that particular contract, because consideration is the most important element of a contract. So that term can be called as nudum pactum. That is, a promise without consideration can be called as the nudum pactum, and it is treated as void. Okay, so this is the general rule. If there is no consideration, there is no contract. But there are certain exceptions to this general rule. That is, if there is no consideration, no contract. There are certain exceptions that we are going to discuss. First one, promise made on account of natural love and affection. That means, in a family, there are sons as well as daughters. There is father-son relationship, father-daughter relationship and all. And if the father is promising to the son to do a particular thing, it cannot be treated as a consideration, right? That means there is an exception to the general rule. We have said that if there is no consideration, there is no contract. But in the case of natural love and affection, for example, the father and son relationship or father and daughter relationship, if the father is offering something to the son without any consideration, it will be treated as a valid thing, because if there is no consideration, no contract. That is general rule. But in that general rule, there is this exception, that is, promise made on the account of natural love and affection cannot come under the general rule, no consideration, no contract. That is the first thing. And second one, promise to compensate for voluntary services. What do you mean by voluntary services? Voluntary services are the service done by an individual without any force from any other person. So it is done on a voluntary basis or the will of that particular party. So if the promise is to compensate a particular amount for the voluntary services, it does not come under the general rule, no consideration, no contract. It is also an exception. That is, the promise to compensate for voluntary services does not come under the general rule. And third one, agreement to pay time-bearer debt. What do you mean time-bearer debt? Suppose, for example, if I borrow some money from the other person for the contract period is just 3 months. I agreed to repay that particular amount within 3 months, but I am not able to repay that particular amount up to 1 year. Okay, so I cannot pay back that particular debt for a period of 1 year. So it becomes the time-bearer debt. So if there is an agreement to pay a particular amount for a time-bearer debt, it is not considered under the general rule, no consideration, no contract. It is also an exception. That's the thing. Agreement to pay a time-bearer debt does not come under the general rule. Next one, contract of agency. We all know what you mean by contract of agency. It is the relationship between the agent as well as the principal to do a particular thing. So in order to form a contract of agency, there is no need of consideration. Suppose, for example, a principal can appoint an agent without paying something to that particular agent. It is also treated as contract of agency, so there is no need for consideration in that particular contract of agency. So it is also an exception to the general rule. And next one, no consideration is necessary for compromising a due debt, that is accepting less performance. For example, If I borrow 10,000 rupees from a particular person, I just borrowed the money, I just told that particular person I will repay within 3 months, but I cannot repay that 10,000 within that particular 3 months. Okay, so the 1 year came to an end and this particular contract ended, but that particular person doesn't receive the money from me. Okay, so that particular is saying that you don't want to give this 10,000 rupees back, you just give 5,000 rupees back, that is enough for me. Okay, so that can be called as the acceptance of lesser performance. Okay, so if that particular person is ready to accept the lesser performance in a compromise, as a compromise, it does not come under the general rule, that is no consideration, no contract. Okay, so these are the main exception to the general rule: no consideration, no contract. First one, that is the promise made on account of the natural love and affection. Second one, promise to compensate for voluntary services. Then agreement to pay a time buyer debt. Then contract of agency, and also in the compromising of a due debt. So these are the exception to the general rule.